so this is a moment I've been waiting for a while now. This is the reason that I started doing book reviews right here. Right here was because of this one book that I'm about to talk about. Um, and that book is none other than Dune by Frank Herbert. This book is absolutely astounding. This is without a doubt my favorite book I've ever read. It's not like obviously not like a scripture book, like a religious book like the Tripitaka is, but I would still say without a doubt, if I had to choose between either having read Dune or the Tripitaka, I would choose Dune. This book is absolutely astounding. Um, so for yeah, so the reason I chose to read this book was because it originally started off as me having watched the documentary of, I think his name is pronounced Jodorowsky or whatever, like the Mexican Jewish guy, um, who was he was like a super duper like esoteric director who directed really strange movies that were more often than not inspired by drugs. um, I watched the documentary that was about his production of his own Dune movie, um, and how vast that was supposed to be. For those who don't know, his ended up getting canceled because it would have been a 24-hour long movie. So needless to say, it was too long. It was just too long to produce. I don't know if it was just not very cost effective or what, but I'd imagine it was something to do with that, because the script itself for that movie is longer than the original Dune book right here. The script for the movie is longer than this book. I watched that documentary and I was fascinated by it, and I was like, yeah, I'll probably get around to reading Dune someday. Um, and I'm normally not the biggest fan of fiction in general, much less science fiction. Um, but after watching that documentary and then hearing the announcement of the new Dune movie coming out in November, which is probably going to blow, but I have an open mind regardless. After those two things, sorry, and then also one of my best friends having just finished it and telling me about how amazing it is, I figured, okay, maybe I'll give this book a try sooner than I anticipated. So I ordered it online and it came in the mail and I instantly started reading it, and before I even finished the book, I could already tell this is going to be my favorite book of all time, and it was. I actually finished it just last night, and it was an absolutely astounding adventure. What and why is it so good? Well, there are a number of reasons. For starters, the world building is absolutely genius. It's absolutely genius. Um, I don't even know where to start with it. It's such a full world. It's so like you read about something in the world that's like kind of catches your attention. You're like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I wonder. I want to know more about this part of the world, and then you can know more because Frank Herbert wrote about that interesting thing. He took every single part aspect of the world and he just dug this massive like rabbit hole of writing into each small little part of the world. Um, so the world is absolutely vast, and I could talk about the world for hours. Um, it's just in a day where so much art is just completely empty and completely meaningless, and so especially with movie and films today, I feel like I watch so many films and TV shows where it's like, yeah, that world is interesting, like I want to dive into that world a bit deeper, and then once you start to do it, you take the dive and then you hit your head on the shallow concrete because it's not actually that deep. And you're like, oh, well, that was a waste of time. And now I've got to run to the hospital because that was so bad. And now I've got a spinal injury. Um, For example, Marvel. Marvel is hot garbage. Adventure Time. Adventure Time, like Steven, I could name a million children's cartoons, obviously, because that's kind of what those do. But like, all these children's cartoons, they like give the illusion of a grand story and of a world. But then once you dive into it, it's just pathetic, and it's honestly depressing. There's so much of that out there like that today. And Dune is not one of those things. Is Dune delivers in everything. It does not trick you in any manner. It does not cast an illusion in any way. Like you read about the Bene Gesserit and you're like, oh wow, that's interesting. I wonder if he's developed a deep lore about the Bene Gesserit. Like what's the story behind the Bene Gesserit? What like where did they come from? What's their origins? What do they do? It's all there. You can read about all of it, and it's amazing. Um, the setting is completely amazing. The setting is beautiful. The setting is on a barren desert planet called Arrakis, but it's typically referred to, or not even typically, but it's sometimes referred to as Dune, which is why the book is called Dune. Um, it's on a barren wasteland of a planet that never gets rain. There's no bodies of water anywhere. It's barely able to sustain any life. Um, and the the life forms that are indigenous to this planet live on very very little water, um, and water is seen essentially as a very scarce resource that could be sold for great amounts of money, almost like water is like gold on Arrakis, right? um, and whenever I put myself in the setting of Dune, I find its desolation beautiful. I've always loved the desert. I love going to sand dunes, um, and it's the feeling of the desert and the desolation. It's mystifying, and it's isolating. It's beautiful, and you just get a sense of like complete desolation and isolation, and I mean that in a good way. And Dune's very so excellently captures that. There's sandworms, which if they hear you stepping on the sand, they'll come over and they'll eat you. Um, there's the spice. The spice is it's a spice obviously that when you eat it, you're supposed to gain like a sort of like prescient ability. In other words, like the ability to see the future, but only to like certain extents, and it varies differently with everyone. And by the way, there are rules for the spice, and the rules are very excellently written. It's not just the rules for the spice aren't abstract. Um, and the uh, maybe it might be best to not talk about that to avoid spoilers, but um, it all has rules and it all flows perfectly. Um, and then there's the Fremen as well, which are the indigenous humans of Dune, and these guys are absolute troopers. They have invented something called still suits, which essentially capture the moisture that your body has ejected, usually through sweat, and then it filters out the salt or whatever, filters it back into just normal drinkable water, so that you can pretty much just live off of your body's own water. Like your body has its own water cycle almost. It's really really interesting. Um, the Fremen are some of the one of the coolest races I've ever read about in any fictional novel. With their sheer strength and their traditions and their rights, and it's all it's all just completely amazing. Um, and then what next? The plot is amazing too. Um, I've already talked quite at length about what Dune is, but essentially the main character is a child named Paul Atreides, who was born on a planet named Caladan, which is kind of like a normal planet. I imagine it's quite similar to Earth, very abundant in water. He was born on this planet, but his father was the Duke of Dune. And then Paul, as he progresses through the story and as he goes to Dune, he learns more about himself and how he is essentially destined to fulfill. He's destined to fulfill a long living prophecy amongst the Fremen, and it's about him. It's about him essentially. Um, I don't want to go too much further in it to avoid spoilers, but it's essentially about him um, existing amongst the Fremen and like turning into this great prophet that they call Muad'Dib among the Fremen, and that's essentially the plot. Then there's also you could also talk about like the Harkonnens who have like long been tyrannizing Dune and exploiting it for its resources. Um, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the characters for a bit. The characters, as with everything else in this book, are expertly written. They're expertly done. They all they all feel so incredibly real. Every single one of them, from Paul to Stilgard to Lady Jessica to Duke to Dr. Yue, all of them are completely convincing characters. They have the things that Frank Herbert has made them feel are exactly what you would expect that kind of character to be feeling in that situation. And the character arcs for each character are amazing as well. Paul has the single best character arc I have ever seen in any story. It's amazing. Every single time Paul makes a progression into his next highest self, into like his next highest position, he's exactly ready for that transition. Every single every single action he does is perfectly fit within his character at that time, and he perfectly progresses up to the man that he's destined to be. And then his mother, watching him go through all that, she's constantly astounded by that, and she goes through her own development with that. And oh man, there's just so much in this book that I could talk about. There's even just there's the absolute cosmic love between uh, um, between Paul and someone who I will not name to avoid spoilers. Um, but there's even romance, and there's only a little bit of romance in this book. Don't go into this book expecting a romantic novel, but it's there. And when it does portray it, it's like some of the most beautiful romance you'll ever seen. Like it's literally cosmic levels of romance. Is how beautiful it is. The book is completely mystical, and it deals a lot with the concept of like prophets and like God and being um, and like control over the mind, right? It teaches a lot about Stoicism as well, which is quite interesting. Um, there's a lot of mystical themes throughout the book, which I obviously love. That's one of the reasons I was able to tolerate this science fiction novel, is because it wasn't purely just science fiction. Like science, if you, in my personal opinion, science fiction is not that good. Like Star Trek, boring. Star Wars is okay because it's kind of similar to Dune, where it's like half half. Um, I don't know. I can't even think of any other science fiction stories right now because they're all so boring to me. But that's why I was able to not only tolerate but enjoy Dune so much, is because it's not just science fiction. It has mysticism thrown in there as well. And the main motif of the book, you could say, is a quote from the very first chapter, which goes, "That which submits rules," which is a very Christian concept. It's very interesting because if I'm not mistaken, Frank Herbert was a Zen Buddhist at the time of writing this book. Although he grew up Catholic, he grew up Christian. But he converted to Zen Buddhism at the time of writing this book. But it's quite interesting because you can still see a lot of his Christian roots show up in the book. the book has a very extremely Christian motif, which is the motif of humility, right? That which submits rules. Humble yourself before your master, and then one day you shall become as the master. That is a very Christian teaching. Um, what else? What else can I say about this book? I think I think that covers a lot of the things I wanted to talk about. There's an entire ecosystem for Dune. It's it's amazing. It is easily a 10 out of 10 book. No doubt in my mind that this is a 10 out of 10. This is by far the best book. The best non-scriptural book I've ever read in my entire life. And I would recommend it to anyone in a heartbeat. Um, it is a pretty long book. It's about that thick. Um, it's just over 500 pages if you include the appendices at the very end, which talk about the ecosystem. Excuse me, the ecosystem of Dune. They talk about um, a bit about the history of the Bene Gesserit, um, and just like about the world and the terminology. But including those, it's just over 500 pages. Um, the book is divided into three books within itself, within the same binding. Um, there's Book One, Dune; Book Two, Muad'Dib; Book Three, The Prophet. Um, and it took me it, it it took me just over 2 weeks to read the whole thing, which is pretty fast for my pace. I'm not a fast reader, but especially if it's a book I like as much as Dune, I read a lot, and I read for a long time when I read. Um, but if you're going to read this book, I definitely recommend busting through book one as fast as you can. Don't sacrifice attention for speed though. You definitely still want to pay full attention to the book one, but I would just recommend just dumping time into getting through book one because book one can be a little bit slow. That's not to say it's not interesting though, but it can be a little slow, and I just recommend getting that out of the way as fast as possible because it really starts to pick up in book two, and in book three everything goes down and it's amazing, and it's it's just a masterpiece. I don't know what else I can say. Frank Herbert is an absolute genius. Talks about environmentalism as well. Um, oh, one of the goal of Duke Leto with the House Atreides is to turn Dune into a paradise with greenery and lakes and such. But yeah, um, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about with this book. It's just yeah, it's the cover is right. Science fiction's supreme masterpiece. Yeah, 10 out of 10 book. Would definitely recommend you read this. So yeah, that's about it.